Thank you for that introduction and a very warm welcome to the Govern with Care virtual forum. I'm very pleased to be here and would just like to start by acknowledging with thanks the work of LASA and the Governance Institute in bringing this program together. I've got the great pleasure of exploring the future of Standard 8, which of course it's really a speculative session as opposed to anything that has any particular hard components. And I will just acknowledge I do have a little bit of laryngitis, so my voice is a little croaky, so just bear with me. Just very quickly before we kick in, for those of you who haven't met me before, my name is Cynthia Payne. I'm the principal of Anchor Excellence. We're a national aged care specific governance and executive transformation business based out of New South Wales. And we've been working with a number of organisations over the past 4 years. So I'd just like to start by acknowledging with thanks the brands of organisations that have chosen to work with us, and as we've supported them with such initiatives like improving governance, improving compliance, and supporting leaders at all levels, at a governance, management, and a service level. I'd also like to acknowledge our key collaborative partners, being Thomson Geer and AusMed, and certainly acknowledging with gratitude our affiliation with LASA, and we look forward to supporting the new merged organisation in ACPA. So I've only got 20 minutes with you, so I'm really conscious of really using the time to full benefit. The objectives, really what I've set for this session is to start by just considering Standard 8 as we have it for the aged care standards, give some perspectives on my views about particularly Standard 8, and start to explore when we compare and contrast to the NDIS practice standards as well as the quality standards that apply to hospitals, just speculate what might come in any transformation of a Standard 8 review. I'm then going to shift gears into having a little look at the sector performance report, and particularly what are the emerging trends and the lessons learned that we already know about the application of Standard 8 as it's structured today. I'm going to shift gears into what was just before the election, the Morrison government's bipartisan approach to the bill, and particularly the advisory body elements. Now, of course, caveat is this was before the Albanese government, Labor government has taken over, and we know that the next sitting season or sitting session is in July. So there is still a little bit of uncertainty as to what might come. And then I'm going to conclude with what my wish list is for Standard 8, because I think as part of that reform agenda, I think it would be fair to say, from my view, Standard 8's a really kind of eclectic pull together of a number of criteria or requirements, and really haven't set the right level of clarity, especially dealing with the diversity of the organisations in the sector, really large organisations right down to standalone providers, community-based or private sector. And we have experience across the whole sphere. So I'm not going to take you through all the standards. I'm working on the assumption that as a participant, you've got a reasonable understanding. But I think my first comments here is, I think the whole sector underappreciated how the Quality and Safety Commission would be tackling the compliance assessment of Standard 8. Standard 8 being a linking component to those other standards. And at the very beginning, in that post-Royal Commission era, I think it was fair to say that a lot of governing boards thought it was more about what they were doing in the boardroom, as opposed to what we've now really experienced over the last couple of years, which is a genuine interpretation between that first consumer statement in terms of the consumer, each consumer lens, the absolute paramount connection point of Standard 2 and Standard 3. And I say that equally for home care services, because for me, the lessons learned out of residential aged care are the canary in the mine shaft lessons learnt for home care services, because of course, as we know, they are the same standards, whilst for home care services some don't apply, and a very particular call out to Standard 5, but we do have some nuanced depending on the packages for particularly Standard 3. And I am going to touch on that sector performance report, because we can see, even though the volume of assessments for home care providers have not been the same as res care providers, we can see some emergent trends. Standard 8 is really all about that overarching accountability. And I often flag to people, when we actually look at the quality care standards, there is no quality management system call out. It really is embedded in this Standard 8, in this oversight and governing component. So governing being, for a smaller organisation, it will be the intersect of the board or the governing organisation with the CEO and the management team, and there might be more engagement in a smaller organisation. Whereas in a larger organisation, we certainly see the emphasis on the translation through the management team. So this is where what happens in the regional or executive function becomes actually more in focus. And less in focus around what actually the governing body is doing, because it's around that translation of what actually is happening to the consumer's lived experience. Now, Standard 8, and this is the whole of the high-level requirements, it really is a bit of an eclectic mix of statements. I think when these were put together, and this is just my own personal opinion, they were really in a development phase, and I'm really optimistic that as part of the reform agenda, we will see an improvement in the overall structure of Standard 8 and particular clarity around the criteria, because as I touch on a little bit later, it's been more about a kick-on effect of how the other standards are assessed rather than a genuine independent assessment of Standard 8, with the exception of 8.3c. I think 8.3c has evolved with the quality assessment process being a little bit more targeted, but I use the language kick-on effect, which is how Standard 2, Standard 3 and those other standards get assessed really cultivates an interpretation of Standard 8 rather than Standard 8 being genuinely assessed in its own merit. The other point I would make here is if I look at 8.3e, we see the important connection of a clinical governance framework, yet 8.3d, the first point, which is high impact, high prevalent risk, is actually one of the key functions of a clinical governance committee, yet it's kind of separated as a requirement. So I kind of flag that because I think, again, for organisations, the clinical governance framework has honed in on 8.3EI, number 2 and number 3. And of course, the relevance is the clinical governance framework really is also embracing all that 8.3D picks up as well, including some of those 8.3B elements as well. So again, in the maturity of focus here, we are seeing organisations revisiting those clinical governance frameworks to make sure that they are better reflecting the organisation's interpretation of the model of care and approach. And that really, from my perspective, is a natural evolution of improving that clinical governance framework. Now, it'd be fair to say for directors that are joining this particular forum, and if you've heard me speak before, that emphasis that all directors need to have the literacy associated with clinical governance, whilst it's absolutely important that your clinical governance committee, your board matrix and the composition of your board picks up a good skills matrix, it is also absolutely important that all directors are picking up the health literacy of understanding the indicators of the outcomes of your clinical governance and also understanding what those results mean. So if we look at the national quality indicators, making sure that everybody understands the data that management is reporting against so that the board can ask really good questions and inform themselves over the performance of that aged care organisation, be it a home care provider or a res care provider. I really don't discern the differences. Now, if I kind of crystallise what is Standard 8 and what are the key drivers for success, these are kind of the crunchy bits that every organisation really needs to be nailing, and that includes consumer engagement. The governing bodies really need to be understanding that, not just delegating it to management, but really engaging in what consumer engagement looks like for your board, really driving that accountability, translating through the management team right down to the consumer interface, being your first line of defence, irrelevant of the size of your organisation. And this balancing between both effective governance systems but also this very strong focus around clinical governance. And I think you've got some sessions coming up in this forum, which will unpack a little bit more about clinical governance. But as a foundation for everyone is this effective risk management, whole of business effective risk management. And so when we explore the role and the function of the Quality and Safety Commission, this in itself becomes even more paramount if you're wanting to avoid the challenges of serious non-compliance. So if I just kind of unpack 8.3a and 8.3b and we reflect on the governing body here, it really is this combination of oversighting all the other elements that Standard 8 have. But if we just kind of hone in on consumer engagement and culture, we can see that, you know, it's really a range of issues here, an organisation-wide approach to involving consumers, asking for input from consumers, not just surveys or satisfaction levels. And I think organisations that have been very just focused on satisfaction have found that they've really not harnessed what Standard 8 is all about, and how the boards are ensuring the reviewing and the responding to that information. So not just receiving the reports of management, but actually genuinely engaging in the communication back out to that consumer group. And then if we look at the other side for culture, for boards to really reflect on what are they actually doing to promote a culture of safe and inclusive delivery of quality of care services, and how does the board account for itself in its oversight of what all of the standards have, not just Standard 8. So as I was preparing for this session, I couldn't help but think about, well, if we were to change Standard 8, how would we consider what it could be improved? So I went actually investigated and had a little look at the NDIS practice statements. It would be fair to say we've seen a coalescence between NDIS and aged care. We're not there yet, but not a bad idea to actually go and have a look. And I also went and had a look at the National Safety and Quality Health Service Standards to also consider how that evolution has occurred. And what might that, if we were to focus on that kind of an element. So when you get my slide deck, you do have those live links there, just acknowledging those organisations. So let's just start with the quality standards in aged care, so home care and res care. The first comment, of course, they're binary. There is no graded assessment. You either meet them or you don't. And the language embedded in the standards are requirements at each consumer level. And I think it would be fair to say that as we've been understanding the approaches by the Quality and Safety Commission, the absolute criticality of those risk-based questions at the beginning of an assessment to understand that element of sampling, and also the consumers that proactively come forward to engage in that assessment process. These standards are the same for all service streams. So of course, I'm calling out here residential, flexible and home care, of course, depending on the program as to whether or not all of the standards apply. And of course, for home care, we know standard 5 is not applicable. In aged care, we know that it is driven by assessment from the consumer sample. So it is not a broad brush. It is absolutely biased through that risk-based questions and hones in on that the language is the governing body is accountable. So we see a certain semantics that come through the standard. The aged care standards, it would be fair to say they are not discretely assessing systems and processes, and this will make sense when I go a bit more into NDIS and also the hospital standards. Now, when I compare this to some of the other standards, just calling out, NDIS, for example, does call out emergency and disaster management, but in the aged care standards, it's implied under the risk management component of Standard 8. The whole approach of the standards in aged care comes from an intent. So we talk about the language of requirements, but there are no specifically key tasks or criteria. We see the guidance material that the Commission has made available, and I do acknowledge that that has been a consistent resource since the inception of the standards, but over time, based on the Commission's learning of the industry's performance, the interpretation of the detail of risk has evolved. And I think it would be fair to say that for some providers, they've learnt that during the course of an assessment visit. Now, if I shift gears into NDIS, The language is a little different. So we see it's still binary. You have to meet or should meet the indicators. The language is not requirements, but indicators. And the practice standards depend on the mix of the service type. So again, they are all assessed at the each consumer level, but we do know that there are some modules that are dependent on the service type, a little bit different to the structure of the residential aged care standards. There are aligned audits for each focus point, so a little bit more clarity than what we see in the aged care standards. And importantly, governance is a core module. So therefore it applies to everyone, just like residential and home care in the aged care standards. But the language is not so much about accountable, it's about overseeing. Whereas when we get to the hospital standards, we see the language champion, which is again a subtle difference. Risk, of course, under the NDIS is absolutely at the participant level, whereas aged care standards, we're using the narrative consumer. But it also embraces worker and provider level. So a little bit of a different focus here with workers, whereas in Standard 7, we see an emphasis on the workforce, but not specifically risk as it relates to workers. Quality management is addressed as a specific call out, which is what we don't see in the aged care standards. And as I mentioned before, there is a particular focus on emergency and disaster management. And assessment is led by clarity in practice standards around the indicator requirements, so very specific indicator requirements. Now, if I finalise and shift into the National Safety and Quality Health Service standards, and of course you've got the link there, again, they are binary. The difference is the language is that you have to meet the action tasks to be accredited. So very similar to the quality standards, if you are found at an assessment not to meet those, there is an obligation on that service or that health service organisation, HSO, to put in place a strategy to remedy, and there is a specific time frame. And of course, if you don't meet those action tasks, then of course the service will not be accredited. Now, interestingly, with the standards here, we see a particular call out to a clinical governance standard, but there is also separately a comprehensive care standard. So the more granular element of the follow through of care comes in a separate standard. And the focus of that clinical governance standard is on governance, leadership and culture. Language being to champion, so not using the language accountability, not using the language of oversee, but to champion. Now, the comprehensive care standard does bring that real cascading of tasks down to the clinician-led level. Very different to what we see in both NDIS and the aged care standards. But really, I think quite positively, we see much more detailed reflective questions, key tasks that the health service organisation must work through, and guidance around strategies for improvement. And particularly here, a call out of the difference between hospital day procedures and small hospitals. So again, reflecting on Standard 8, we don't see the difference really clarified between a large organisation's interpretation of Standard 8 and, say, for example, that standalone family-owned provider or community-based organisation. So I think that's an important evolution I personally would like to see evolving. So a little bit of difference. And I think, my general perspective at this stage is I think the way in which the evolution of what we see in the National Safety and Quality Health Service standards is where we would be aspiring to move towards. So we'll see in the reform agenda whether or not that in fact is what happens and that organisation takes on the evolution of aged care standards, or whether or not they will ultimately stay within the Quality and State Safety Commission. So just again, reflecting on this assessment methodology is to remember that for the Standard 8, it really is a bottom-up assessment. So that image that I have on the right-hand side really puts into perspective for directors that are sitting at the top of the organisation, the temptation is to just stay at that top-down perspective, not necessarily really fully grasping that bottom-up component. We know that Standard 8 is interpreted at the waterline there at the bottom, which is that balance between high impact, high prevalent risk, key elements of clinical governance, weighted and balanced against lived experience. So those drivers of substandard care, harm producing elements for consumers, and that direct connection to what might lead to serious non-compliance. Very important to understand that assessment is biased to those risk-based question sampling that happens at the beginning of assessment. So those risk management systems that providers equally need to match understanding the higher risk components of consumers as a prioritisation to that risk management approach. And my final comment here is to remind everyone, and Janet Anderson, as our Quality and Safety Commissioner, has been very consistent in her commentary around the remit of the Commission: prevent, protect and respond. And draw your your attention to the annual report, where the Commissioner makes quite clear what is the purpose and the remit of the Commission: to protect and enhance the safety, health, wellbeing and quality of life for aged care consumers, engaging through effective engagement with them, regulation and education of Commonwealth-funded aged care service providers, and resolution of their complaints. They're the rules of engagement that we have, and of course, as part of that reform agenda, my practical view is I don't expect to see that changing significantly, but a maturing in the evolution of how the standards will evolve. So let's quickly shift gear now into the sector performance report. The Quality and Safety Commission, of course, produced this report quarterly. We're imminently due another update. The data that's the latest data is the January to March 2022 data. And we've got a focus here on the top 10 requirements for non-compliance. Residential aged care on your left-hand side, home care on your right-hand side. And really the call out here is noticing that Standard 8 really is in that top area of non-compliance in both areas. Equally, we see the balancing of a real focus on both Standard 2 and Standard 3. What does that tell us? It tells us that the balance and focus around clinical governance, understanding high impact, high prevalent risk, how that translates to the lived experience for consumers, and criticality, what is the governing oversight? So if we look at home care, we see 8.3D with a real call out to risk management systems, 8.3E for clinical governance, and on the left-hand side for residential aged care, again, 8.3C really as a key call out, effective governance systems, and 8.3E for governance, clinical governance framework. So if you're not already evolving your clinical governance frameworks, I would be encouraging you as a board to make sure that this is well and truly on your focus for this year with the management team. So again, I'm just bringing focus here to the state of play in the sector, residential aged care. And important to call out here are the different colours that are in this particular graph. So at the bottom we see the paler kind of green, which is very few requirements not met. The pink, which is some requirements not met. But what I want to flag here is where many or all requirements are not met. And if we have a little look at Standard 8, and this is for residential aged care, we see quite a proportion where many or all of the requirements are not met. Standard 3, we see that there are less components but a larger volume of providers where there are not met. So a really important connection there. Standard 2, we absolutely see almost a third where we see many or all of the requirements not met. So what's the key messages here? And this is equal for res care and home care. Standard 8 is in your top 10. They commonly link to Standard 2 and Standard 3 because there is this kick-on effect, which is quite important to understand. If we have a little look at home care, very similar graph here. So whilst the volume of assessments are not the same for residential aged care, we really do need to see residential aged care as that, I use that language, the canary in the mine shaft, as an eye on what's coming as that volume of assessments come up. And again, draw your attention to Standard 8, where we see where those assessments have happened, many or all requirements not met. Now, of course, the sample size is not the same as residential aged care, but something that home care providers absolutely need to be putting attention to as they're understanding, again, this evolution of Standard 8. So what are the typical themes if we understand the not met kind of themes in Standard 8? And this is our experience in lots of different organisations, different sizes. And we see these key messages around consumers not genuinely being supported to engage in care planning and delivery, care and service plans that are not in a form that is easy for consumers to understand. So this real translating information so that it actually meets the consumer's needs, seeing the connection to cultural safety as well as English as a second language, so call out for called communities, making sure that you've got that translation, advocacy or interpretation that's necessary. Connection in Standard 8 here, compulsory education, whatever it is that you need to be providing, that the systems in place to support governance are not being adhered to. So again, how your oversight of what actually are your governance systems, how are you satisfying themselves, and in particular, the governing of your clinical management systems. Again, that call out to clinical governance. Incidents, so again, the Commission has put a very strong emphasis on incident management systems in 2022. We see that through the Quality Bulletin, how the Governing Board is using that to really oversight that incident management system. For residential aged care, the connection to the Serious Incident Response Scheme, and for home care providers, when that comes in, gearing up to that new world of what SIRS is going to look like for home care. Again, some granular kind of issues coming out, again, mainly focused on residential aged care, high impact risk monitoring. So again, that specific call out to clinical governance. And these are the links to Standard 2 and Standard 3. For residential aged care, and we are seeing this becoming an issue for home care restrictive practices. So whilst the restrictive practice legislation is bound specifically to flexible care and residential aged care, it is also an important consideration, and we see the evolution of more complex care and people staying at home longer. Connected to that, de-prescribing, and we know that for restrictive practices there are 5 core call-outs. Open disclosure, antimicrobial stewardship, and these particularly linked to Standard 7. And of course, for home care, a specific call-out to elder abuse. So that focus around, we just had World Health Elder Abuse Day. Standard 8 for home care is predominantly interpreted through that applicability of elder abuse and protection of consumers. Through residential aged care, I think it would be fair to say the main emphasis is on the Serious Incident Response Scheme and reportables, but we will see an expectation that providers are having very clearly articulated elder abuse prevention policies. So if I shift gear again now and move into what was in the bill. So this table was a summary of what was in the bill just before the election. The bill did not go through. So in those schedules, just a really kind of quick high level call out, we saw in Schedule 1, ANAC obviously replacing ACVI. That train is clearly leaving the station and we are on a program. There are still some elements within that bill that will need to be finalised, but overall the train has left the station. In this bill, we saw the screener working component, both for workers and governing persons. And so when we see the July sitting, we'll see whether or not this comes through. Schedule 3, which picked up the Code of Conduct and the banning orders. And Schedule 4, that extension of SIRS or SEARS, depending on how you like to say it, the Serious Incident Reporting Scheme, into home care. Schedule 5 was the big one for the governing body. So remember, Standard 8 is specific to the standards, but as approved providers, we'll see the connection to the accountability principles. And this is where we see these components of the advisory bodies, some changes forecast regarding mix of governing body, as well as staff member skill mix and development, and some of the bigger structural issues around board composition. This was probably the most contentious issue. So it'll be interesting to see whether or not the Albanese government just simply moves ahead the way it was constructed, or whether or not it will be revisited. So there's a little bit of, we don't know, and will be in the hands of ACPA as they produce that advocacy going forward. The bill had quite a lot more in it. Of course, Schedule 6 regarding information scheduling, 7, the use of refundable deposits and accommodation bonds, Schedule 8, the Independent Health and Aged Care Pricing Authority. Of course, that body has not been active yet because it needs to be enacted, is my understanding, as a result of this bill. Schedule 9, some further adjustments to restrictive practices. and Schedule 11 around publication of aged care financial reports and general purpose financial statements. And again, it would be fair to say that the Department of Health are already very clearly moving in that component. So let's just touch now on governing bodies as opposed to the governance structure. So the governing body in the context of the aged care standards is the left-hand side. It's the governance board. In this reform agenda, we are seeing, if the bill goes through, an evolution of the setup of advisory boards. And I think it would be fair to say, just as an upfront comment, let's be really clear about what is the difference between them. And I'd like to just acknowledge here the work of the Advisory Board Centre, which is an organisation that is very much focused on best practice for advisory boards. A governing board is at heart a decision-making board, whereas an advisory board is a problem-solving board. It's not the same thing. So if we see the advisory boards coming through in this agenda, it would be fair to say that they will be a slightly different focus and really will add significant value to those governing boards. So in that bill, we see the evolution of language of a quality care advisory board and a consumer advisory board. But I just want to make that point. It is not a subcommittee of the board. And again, we'll need to see what happens with that bill and how the Quality and Safety Commission interpret it and provide additional guidance going through. What's kind of key here is that we do know that there are 902 operators, over 200,000 consumers, and right now nearly 42% of the sector is actually operating at a loss. So it would be fair to say that whatever comes with these governing bodies, there's going to be an important focus that they are sustainable, cost-effective, and they really do add the value that the organisation is going to need to be more sustainable and more compliant as it moves through that organisation. So just a specific call out now to the Advisory Board Centre. The Advisory Board Centre is the global professional body for the advisory board sector. They provide certified chair credentials, and I just acknowledge I am a certified chair. But I'm also working with an aged care advisory board. So the Advisory Board Centre is proactively working in this space. You'll see the participants down on the left-hand side, particularly calling out the work of Louise Brockman, who is the founder and driver of the Advisory Board Centre. We are collectively working on materials and guidance that will assist the aged care sector as we move forward and we watch this bill unfolding in order that aged care providers can really go about setting up a best practice approach to their advisory boards. So my final conclusion for you is my wish list for Standard 8. And these are just my kind of top of mind, really key issues. At the end of the day, we will be in the hand of the Department of Health and the Quality Commission and the work of ACPA, those advocates, consumer organisations working in the reform agenda. My personal view is I'd really like us to see to move towards a more structured framework that follows the NHSQS model. I think it's much more clearer, much more accountable, less open to subjective assessment. I think clinical governance really does need to be improved in the way that Standard 8 is structured with its own focus rather than kind of like the eclectic way that it sits in there at the moment. I don't think it really speaks to the differences in organisations. I'd really like to see the evolution of objective assessment criteria for systems and processes, not just the way it's biased at the moment lens through the consumer experience, because it really isn't a robust assessment of systems and processes. And I think organisations benefit from that. I think it's important that we keep that focus on sampled consumers, but I'd rather see that it's a proper, robust cover of the sample rather than what I use the language cherry picking. So there isn't necessarily a consistent methodology that in the sampling, all of the requirements are lensed through that consumer sample. It really is a little bit open to the quality assessors and their approach to identifying the risks for the providers at that each consumer level. I'd really like to see that the standards evolve to provide better guidance tailored to meet the different sizes of organisations, clearer expectations for smaller providers. I think it would be fair to say for, family-owned standalone providers or community-based organisations, they will absolutely benefit with some specific guidance versus what's expected of larger providers. I'd really love to see graded assessment. I know that we do have that binary, you either meet it or you don't meet it. And I would really like to see us starting to acknowledge those who are doing more than merely meeting the standards. So graded assessment has the benefit of that last point, which is opportunities for providers to be recognised for going beyond or demonstrating excellence, you know, what is better than benchmark, and really delivering a great outcome for consumers. We need to support everyone right now through the reform agenda. And from my perspective, that really is encouraging organisations, supporting them with that evolution, and a little less focus on just what's not going right, also encouraging the great work that we see going on in the industry. Please don't hesitate to reach out if there's anything that I've touched on that you'd like to further explore. Enjoy the rest of your forum. Best wishes and have a great day.